Now, we want to cover the subject of the relationship between vaccines and human reproduction, since that was one of Yaqub's objectives on the island of Patmos in the making of the Caucasian people and the brown and yellow races. And since it's the aim of the synagogue of Satan, following his pattern to control human reproduction, we want to address that. But before doing that, we want to set the stage with this short clip from a discussion that I had with Dr. Abdul Alim Muhammad in 2009. Please watch this.
Right, and it's no wonder that we have the WHO now also. I mean, all the hands seem to be the same hands.
Yeah. And see, that issue of vaccine contamination is the number one reason that in 1997, I issued, as the Minister of Health and Human Services for the Nation of Islam, a moratorium on vaccines. It wasn't that I had a problem with the validity of the theory of vaccination. I think I have more concern about that now than I did at that time. But it was really the simple issue of contamination.
Right.
That even if vaccines are good, in theory, they certainly are not good if they're contaminated.
Right.
And all vaccines that I know about that are administered in the United States of America are contaminated. And of course, the original contaminating virus that appeared in the polio vaccine, going back to the late 50s and into the 60s, and to 2009, the polio vaccine administered in 2009 is still contaminated with the SV40 virus, simian virus number 40, properly known as the polyoma virus. And poly means many, oma means tumors or cancer. So the polyoma virus was actually the first virus that was discovered that could actually cause cancer.
Right, and this is why, I mean, some people attribute the rise in cancer to that.
Absolutely. You see, that's why in the 1950s, a woman's chances of getting breast cancer may have been less than 1 in 10, and a man's chance of getting prostate cancer was even less than that. But now, and then by the time I was in medical school, you see, in 1975, the risk of breast cancer was 1 in 6 or 1 in 7, and now it's 1 in 3.
Wow.
And every time that tumor that appears in the breast in a woman or in the prostate in a man has been studied for the presence of SV40, there that cancer virus is. It doesn't cause cancer right away. It causes cancer 30, 40, and 50 years after the injection. So almost no one is able to connect the dots, you see. But, and now, just as recently as 10 years ago or so, when my schoolmate, Dr. David Satcher, he was in D.C., so I invited him to come by the clinic because I wanted to talk to him about vaccines.
Now, he was the head of the CDC.
At that time, he was the head of the CDC, later became the Surgeon General.
Yes, sir.
So at that time, he was the head of the CDC, and he was mounting a strong campaign to see that all Americans received all of their vaccines. And so I asked him about SV40, and he was the one that informed me of what I didn't know. I didn't know that it was still in the vaccines.
Oh.
I thought that when they had discovered it in the 60s that they took steps to remove it. He said, no, it's still there. It's still there. And then he poo-pooed the risk, saying that it wasn't worth doing anything about.
Right,
and then I asked him about, well, what about the epidemic in cancer that we're experiencing in this country? And I don't quite remember what but he didn't see that there was a connection. But I think there is. I think there is.
A lot of people have written about that. They didn't see cancer till vaccines became, widespread. But getting back to the 1997 moratorium, because I remember that I was, with you working here and there in the clinic during your campaign against vaccination. That moratorium has not been lifted.
No, it hasn't. Now, just to give the historical context,
please.
I issued a moratorium, and my understanding is a moratorium is sort of like a temporary measure.
Right.
And the idea was we would have a moratorium on vaccines until such time as we could convene a conference of experts. So I contacted the National Medical Association, the CDC, the AMA, and other official medical bodies around the country, and we were going to convene a vaccine conference in Chicago in that summer.
Right, right.
And then for one reason or another, that conference actually never materialized. And so we never had that convening, because at that time I was aware of the contamination issue, but I didn't know how far it went, and I was sort of sitting on the fence. You see, I didn't want to be rash or premature in my judgment.
Right, right.
But that conference never took place to fully air the issue, so that we could then develop a definitive policy.
Right.
But now, I guess the moratorium has become policy. And I would say that everything that I've learned since then convinces me even more the rightness of that moratorium against vaccines.
Yes, sir. Well, you were divinely guided, and I'm glad you said that, because even today, among the believing community of the Nation of Islam, of course, we serve our people, which is a larger group, but just dealing with among us, you still have some who are not really aware of the dangers of vaccines, and particularly now in this day and time with all of the genetic engineering, the secrecy, the money involved, and maybe other diabolical aims. It even makes that moratorium even more right for us to follow today.
Yeah. Now at that time, just to complete the story, one of the people that I consulted was Dr. John Martin. And Dr. Martin had been in charge of vaccine safety for the FDA. I mean, he was the chief of vaccine safety. Here's a guy, he's a PhD, MD, and what he found out as the head of vaccine safety is he didn't have any teeth.
Oh, okay.
He didn't have any administrative force and power. He could not even compel the pharmaceutical companies who were making these vaccines to tell him what was in the vaccines.
Ain't that something?
They had it written such that that kind of information was considered proprietary information, that the pharmaceutical companies only had to divulge voluntarily, if at all.
Right.
And so every year he would send out these long report forms, and they would come back almost blank because they didn't have to fill in anything.
And that still is in effect today.
Yeah. So basically, he was in a position of having to take their word that there was no contamination in the vaccines. Then he told me the reason why he quit. He said because even with all of that lax regulation, occasionally they would discover a batch of vaccines that were contaminated. And he said, now what do you think we would do with it? I said, well, I would hope that you would destroy them. He said, oh no. He said, there's too much money involved. So all we could do was return that batch to the pharmaceutical company. They would change the labels and send it overseas, because there was no law against sending contaminated vaccines overseas, usually to poor countries in Africa and other parts of the world.
Wow. I mean, this shares even a great light. The fact that you talked to the guy who was supposed to be in charge of safety, but how can you do your duty if nobody's even telling you what's in it?
Now he has a website, or I don't know if it's still, I haven't visited in a long time, but if anybody cares to check it out, it's called stealthviruses.com.
Stealthviruses.com.
Because he started a whole line of research. And I asked him, what do you mean stealth viruses? Well, he said, well, how do you detect viruses? They're stealthy. Right. And if you don't already know that it exists, how would you detect it? So if somebody comes up with a novel virus, or one just develops in nature, how would you even know? So he had a website that was developed for the purpose.
Infertility is considered a crisis in the United States and Europe in particular. Both men and women suffer from the inability to produce children.